Welcome to Family Shadows, a place where stories of sacrifice, love, and quiet redemption live on. If you've ever felt touched by the lessons hidden in family dramas, or if you've ever wondered what it truly means to honor those who raised us, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a tale that might remind you of your own. Today's story is titled, "My daughter hid my invitation to Thanksgiving, so I served her a different dish." Henry Collins was 66 years old, though life had worn him into a man who looked both older and younger than that number depending on the light. His hair had gone silver in quiet streaks, like frost climbing over autumn grass. His back curved slightly now, not from weakness, but from decades of bending forward, into work, into sacrifice, into the small acts of care no one kept score of except him. He lived alone in a modest one-story house on the edge of town. The house was nothing special, paint that peeled a little at the corners, a lawn that needed tending, windows that still rattled when the November winds came howling across the hills. But for Henry, the house was sacred. It was where he had raised his children, Amanda and Michael, alongside his late wife, Mary. It was where birthday candles had been blown out and homework assignments forgotten on the kitchen table. It was where laughter had once been louder than silence. Now, most nights, it was just Henry, a cup of lukewarm tea, and the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Thanksgiving was approaching, and like every year, Henry tried not to let his hopes grow too high. He reminded himself that children grew up, that they built lives of their own, that holidays were sometimes just lines on a calendar to younger people. But still, in his heart, he carried the picture of a table filled with family. The kind of Thanksgiving Mary had always insisted on. Mary, even the sound of her name in his mind brought a sting to his eyes. She had been gone 10 years now. She was the glue, the compass, the laughter that filled the cracks. In her absence, Henry had tried to hold the family together. He called, he visited, he kept the traditions alive as best he could. But tradition was a fragile thing when only one person carried it. Amanda, his daughter, was 34 now, successful, polished, married into money. She had a way of speaking that made Henry feel as though his words were always a little behind, like he was the old radio playing static while she lived her life in surround sound. He loved her dearly, but he also knew the distance between them had grown, not in miles but in pride. Michael, his son, was 2 years younger than Amanda. He had a decent job, nothing glamorous, but enough to keep him afloat. Michael was quieter, easier to read. He loved his father. Henry knew, but he often drifted into Amanda's orbit, letting her confidence chart the course for them both. This year, Henry told himself, maybe things would be different. Maybe Amanda would host Thanksgiving and invite him to join, as she had hinted the year before. Maybe Michael would come too, and they would all sit together again, like the old days. He pictured himself at Amanda's long dining table, surrounded by the smells of roasted turkey and cinnamon pie, laughing with his children, talking about memories that felt more alive than the present. Hope was a stubborn thing. The first sign came one Wednesday morning, a week before the holiday. Henry went to fetch the newspaper from the porch, his slippers crunching on the frosted grass. The chill reminded him of mornings long ago when Mary would wrap a scarf around his neck and say, "You'll catch cold if you don't listen." He smiled at the memory, then bent down to collect the rolled paper. On the small table just inside his front door sat a neat pile of mail he hadn't sorted yet, flyers, bills, catalogs. He thumbed through them absent-mindedly, looking for anything addressed by hand. He was waiting, though he didn't admit it out loud, for an envelope that might hold an invitation. Amanda had hosted Thanksgiving the past 2 years, each time more elaborate than the last. He hadn't been at either. The first year, she'd said she thought it would be too hard for him, that maybe he should rest instead. The second year she had mentioned it only afterward, as though it had slipped her mind to include him. Henry had forgiven her both times. After all, she was busy. She had her life. But this year maybe. His hands paused over an envelope. A cream-colored card, the kind Amanda often ordered from those online print shops that promised tasteful, elegant stationery. The return address was hers. His heart leapt. But when he tore it open, he found nothing. The envelope was empty. He frowned, confused. Had something slipped out? He searched the pile again. Then, bending lower, he noticed something odd, the edge of another envelope tucked beneath the glossy weight of a furniture catalog. He pulled it out and his chest tightened. It was the invitation. The card inside was embossed with a gold leaf border. At the top, in Amanda's careful handwriting, it read, "Thanksgiving dinner at our home." Guests were listed. Friends, business partners, names Henry recognized from Amanda's stories. But his own name, Henry Collins, was nowhere to be found. The envelope had been addressed to his house, but it had been hidden, slipped beneath the pile as if Amanda had sent it only because she felt obligated, then prayed he wouldn't find it. Henry sat down in his chair, the invitation trembling in his hands. He stared at the names, at the elegant letters, at the absence of his own place in his daughter's home. The silence of the house pressed in around him. There was no mistake. His daughter hadn't wanted him there. Later that night, Henry set the invitation on the mantel beside Mary's picture. He looked at the photograph, Mary in her apron, flower on her cheek, holding a pie with both hands and laughing into the camera. "What would you say, Mary?" he whispered. "Would you tell me to go anyway? Would you tell me to knock on the door and sit down, no matter what Amanda thinks?" But the photograph, as always, said nothing. It only reminded him of a warmth that had vanished. Henry sighed, rubbed his eyes, and tried to convince himself that he wasn't hurt, that he was above such things. But deep down, the ache was sharp and undeniable. That week, Amanda never called. Michael sent a short text, "Busy week, Dad, talk soon." Henry didn't reply. On Thanksgiving morning, he woke early, the air crisp and biting. He shaved carefully, put on the old white shirt Mary had once ironed for special days, and sat at the table with a single candle lit beside him. The chair across from him was empty. He poured himself a small glass of cider, raised it toward Mary's picture, and whispered, "Happy Thanksgiving, my love." The world outside was filled with laughter and clinking glasses. But in that small house, it was just Henry, the silent photograph of his wife, and the invitation that had never truly been meant for him. And yet, even in that loneliness, something inside him stirred. A thought, a decision, something Mary might have whispered if she were still here. Thanksgiving wasn't about tables or invitations. It was about gratitude, about giving, about remembering those who had less. Henry set down his glass. He wiped his eyes, and for the first time that day he allowed himself a quiet, determined smile. The morning after, Henry moved through his house with the quiet rhythm of a man who had learned to live alone. He made coffee the way Mary used to, 2 scoops, 1 pinch of cinnamon, though the cinnamon had long since stopped tasting the same without her laughter to follow it. The sun slipped in through the blinds in thin golden stripes, dust floating lazily in the light. He shuffled to the small table near the door where the mail still sat. The invitation card remained on top of the pile, its gold border almost mocking him in the morning glow. Henry picked it up once more, running his fingers across the letters, and thought of the moment he had discovered it tucked away beneath the furniture catalog. He had searched twice that night, convinced at first that maybe it had fallen by accident. But the way it was hidden, wedged beneath glossy pages he never touched, spoke otherwise. He replayed Amanda's voice in his mind, the clipped, polite tone she sometimes used with him. "Dad, these dinners, they are different now. It's mostly colleagues, clients, people you wouldn't really know." He wondered if she told herself that was kindness, protecting him from discomfort, or whether she had simply decided that his presence didn't fit the image she wanted to present. The thought stung more than he cared to admit. Henry folded the card and slipped it back into the envelope, setting it aside as if the act could erase what he knew. Then he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair opposite him, and felt the familiar weight of absence pressing down. Later that afternoon, he tried to distract himself. He cleaned the garage, sorted old tools, polished the worn hammer Mary had once used for her craft projects. He found an old photo album in a cardboard box, pictures of Amanda as a child in overalls, holding up a crooked birdhouse with a grin too big for her face. Henry traced her smile with his thumb and whispered, "Where did that little girl go?" By evening, the ache had shifted into something quieter, heavier. He went for a walk around the neighborhood, his hands deep in the pockets of his coat. The houses were lit with warm lamps. Families gathered around television screens or long dining tables. He could almost hear the echoes of laughter spilling out into the street. Every window was a reminder of what his own home lacked. When he returned, he noticed the invitation still perched on the mantel beside Mary's picture. The candle from the night before had burned down to a small pool of wax. He thought about taking the card and tearing it into pieces, but Mary's eyes in the photo seemed to hold him back. Instead, he spoke softly into the quiet room. "Maybe she's ashamed of me, Mary. Maybe the way I dress, the way I live, it doesn't fit her world anymore. And if that's true, I don't know what to do with that." The room gave no answer. Only the tick of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The days moved closer to Thanksgiving, and Henry carried the weight of the hidden invitation with him like an unspoken bruise. When Michael called midweek, his voice hurried and distracted. "Henry didn't mention it. Work's been crazy, Dad. Amanda's planning a big thing this year, you know how she gets." "Yes," Henry said quietly, "I know." He didn't say what he had found. He didn't tell Michael about the card hidden under the pile. He didn't want to make his son choose sides. Instead, he let the conversation trail off, wishing Michael had asked if he was coming, wishing Amanda had picked up the phone herself, wishing, most of all, that Mary were still alive to bridge the gap between them. On the night before Thanksgiving, Henry sat again with the invitation in his hands. He pictured Amanda's house with its polished silverware, the laughter of her friends, the rich aroma of turkey and wine. He imagined himself standing at her door, uninvited, awkward, out of place. He imagined Amanda's face, tight smile, polite words masking the irritation in her eyes. And then he imagined something else, something different, a table not filled with clients and colleagues, but with strangers who had nowhere else to go. A warmth not of appearances, but of gratitude. The thought came like a whisper, gentle but insistent. Perhaps he didn't need Amanda's invitation to have Thanksgiving after all. Perhaps there was another way. Henry folded the card for the last time, set it back on the mantel, and turned off the light. The house fell into darkness, but in his chest, a small spark of resolve began to glow. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a cold, so sharp it felt like glass in the air. Henry woke early, long before the sun had fully risen. The town was still, a blanket of frost stretching across rooftops and lawns, the silence broken only by the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog or the hum of a car starting in the distance. He stood at the window of his bedroom for a while, pulling the curtain back just enough to see his breath fogging the glass. Families would be waking soon, ovens would be warming, kitchens alive with the sound of chopping, mixing, voices overlapping in cheerful chaos. He remembered those mornings with Mary, the two of them bustling around the small kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, his hands clumsy with the carving knife. Amanda and Michael chasing each other through the house, their laughter ricocheting off the walls. Those mornings had been full, even noisy, but Henry would have given anything to hear that noise again. Now the house spoke in whispers, the creak of a floorboard, the sigh of old wood adjusting to the cold. Henry went to the closet and pulled out his best shirt, a white button-down that had thinned at the elbows but still carried the faint scent of lavender from when Mary used to wash it. He smoothed it out carefully, as though ironing not just the fabric but the years it had been folded away. He paired it with a dark tie he hadn't worn in ages and stood before the mirror. The man staring back at him was older than he remembered. Lines had carved themselves deep into his face. His eyes seemed smaller, his shoulders narrower. He touched the knot of his tie, adjusted it twice, and gave himself a small nod. It wasn't about being seen. No one was coming, he knew that. But it was about honoring the day, about holding on to the ritual even if he was the only one left to observe it. He set the table for two. It was a habit he couldn't shake. Across from his own plate, he placed Mary's photograph, propped up in a simple frame, her smile catching the light from the candle he lit beside her. He set a glass in front of her picture, poured a little cider, and raised his own glass in silence. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mary," he whispered. The food was simple. A roasted chicken he had bought the day before, a small bowl of mashed potatoes, and a pie from the bakery down the street. He hadn't tried to make the turkey, not anymore. That had always been Mary's pride, the bird golden and perfect, its smell filling the whole block. Henry knew his attempt would only taste like failure, so he settled for what he could manage, sitting alone at the table, the candle flickering between him and the photo of his wife. Outside, the world was alive with celebration. He could hear faint music drifting from a neighbor's window, bursts of laughter carried by the wind. Somewhere not too far away, Amanda's house would be full of voices, friends and colleagues raising their glasses, plates passed around a polished table. And here he was, carving meat in silence, the scrape of his knife against porcelain the only sound. For a moment, Henry closed his eyes. He tried to pretend, tried to summon the echoes of years past. He imagined Amanda sitting across from him, her hands sticky with cranberry sauce. Michael at his side, stealing bites before grace was said. Mary bustling around, reminding everyone to save room for dessert. The vision came so vividly that his chest ached. When he opened his eyes again, the chair across from him was still empty. The photograph still smiled, frozen in time. Henry lowered his fork. Appetite had deserted him. He sat back in his chair, folded his hands together, and let the stillness wash over him. This was not how Thanksgiving was meant to be, not for a father who had given everything, not for a man who had carried the weight of a family through years of hard work and quiet sacrifice. Yet here he was, invisible, forgotten in the house that once rang with joy. And yet, even in the sharpness of that loneliness, Something deeper stirred inside him. He thought of Mary's words. "Don't let bitterness eat away at you, Henry. When love is not returned, give it anyway." He looked at the half-empty plate before him, at the untouched glass of cider in front of Mary's picture. He thought of the hundreds of people in town who would spend this day on street corners, in shelters, or in empty apartments colder than his own. People who had no table to sit at, no memory to cling to, no photograph to toast across from. Perhaps his daughter didn't want him at her table. Perhaps his family had forgotten what it meant to gather. But that didn't mean he couldn't still give thanks. It didn't mean he couldn't share the day with someone who needed it. Henry stood slowly, his knees stiff from the chill. He blew out the candle, placed the photograph back on the mantel, and gathered what food remained. As he wrapped the pie in foil, a quiet resolve filled him. Thanksgiving was about gratitude, and gratitude was not something to hoard. It was something to pass on. For the first time that day, Henry smiled, not the weary smile of a man pretending, but the faint, genuine smile of a man who had remembered a truth too many others had forgotten. He picked up his coat, pulled on his gloves, and stepped into the cold night, carrying with him not just food, but a decision that would change everything. The night air cut sharp against Henry's cheeks as he stepped outside, the bundled food still warm against his hands. He paused on the porch, watching his breath bloom in small white clouds, and for the first time that day he didn't feel entirely powerless. Something in his chest had shifted like a door opening. He walked back inside briefly, setting the food down on the counter, and looked around his kitchen. It was small, cluttered with the ordinary details of a long life lived quietly. Chipped mugs, a stack of unread newspapers, an old clock that ticked just a little too loud. Nothing here was meant for show, nothing designed to impress. And yet, standing in that space, Henry realized he possessed something greater than appearances. He possessed the capacity to give. He pulled out a large cardboard box from the garage, one of those sturdy ones he had saved from moving years ago. Into it he began to place what he had: the pie, the chicken, loaves of bread he had bought on sale, jars of jam still sealed in the pantry. He added scarves Mary had knitted long ago but never given away, folded carefully into neat stacks. Then he went to his closet and gathered 2 coats he rarely wore anymore. One by one he filled the box until it was nearly too heavy to lift. Henry stopped, resting his hands on the edge of the counter. A thought passed through him, bittersweet and piercing. This is what Mary would have done. She had always seen the overlooked, the forgotten. There had been Christmases when she would bake extra pies, just in case. And somehow those pies always found their way into the hands of someone who needed them. The memory steadied him. He fetched a second box. This one he filled with canned goods, packets of instant soup, and the small chocolates Mary used to slip into Amanda's and Michael's lunchboxes when they were children. He could still see Amanda's delighted grin, Michael's sticky fingers. Now those same sweets would go to children who might not have had candy in months. By the time Henry was done, the boxes were stacked by the door, ready to be carried out. His small living room, usually silent and dim, felt charged with purpose. The ache of being left behind, of being hidden away, loosened just a little in his chest. He sat down briefly to catch his breath, glancing at Mary's photograph on the mantel. The candle had gone out hours ago, leaving her face in shadow, but Henry spoke anyway. "You were right, Mary. It isn't about who invites you to their table. It's about making sure someone has a table at all." When he finally stepped outside again, the boxes balanced carefully in his arms. The neighborhood was alive with the muted sounds of Thanksgiving night. Music spilled from open windows, laughter drifted across frosted lawns, the faint aroma of roasted turkeys hung in the air. Yet Henry's steps felt lighter, carrying him not toward a polished dining room where he wasn't wanted, but toward the city streets where his presence might mean something. He loaded the boxes into the trunk of his old sedan, the same one Amanda had once teased him about. "Dad, you should really get rid of that thing, it's embarrassing." The car groaned a little when he started it, but the engine caught, steady as it always had. Henry patted the dashboard. "Still with me, old friend," he murmured. "One more job tonight." As he drove toward the center of town, he passed houses glowing with light, silhouettes moving across curtains, families raising glasses. The loneliness still lingered, but it no longer hollowed him out. Instead, it pushed him forward. He thought of the faces he might see tonight. Men huddled under bridges, women sitting on cold steps, children bundled in coats too thin for the season. He thought of what it would mean to hand them something warm, something human. Henry parked near the edge of a park he knew well. It was there years ago that he had brought Amanda and Michael to feed ducks on lazy afternoons. Now, as he opened his trunk, he noticed the benches dotted with figures curled into themselves, clutching thin blankets trying to keep out the cold. He carried the first box slowly, his joints aching but his spirit steady. A man with a gray beard lifted his head as Henry approached. The man's eyes, tired and hollow, flickered with surprise when Henry offered him a loaf of bread and a scarf. "For me?" the man asked, his voice cracked. "Yes," Henry said softly. "Happy Thanksgiving." The man's hands trembled as he accepted the gift. His eyes glistened, and for a moment Henry saw a reflection of himself in them. A man forgotten, unseen, waiting for kindness that rarely came. One by one, Henry went to each person he found, offering food, coats, small tokens of warmth. Each thank you, each whispered blessing, filled the emptiness that had haunted him all day. The more he gave, the less heavy the boxes felt, until by the end, he was carrying only the lightness of what remained inside him: gratitude. What Henry didn't notice, what he couldn't have known, was that a young college student sitting on the edge of the park had been watching. She had pulled out her phone, struck by the sight of an old man quietly serving strangers on a night reserved for family. She filmed as he bent down to hand a child a piece of pie, as he draped a scarf over a woman's shoulders, as he patted a man's arm with the tenderness of someone who understood. The video would travel far beyond that park, far beyond Henry's quiet neighborhood. But for now, Henry didn't think of any of that. He thought only of Mary's smile, of the warmth he saw in the faces of the people he helped, and of the truth that Thanksgiving had never been about who welcomed him in, but who he could welcome himself. The boxes in the trunk grew lighter with each trip Henry made into the park. The night was sharp with cold, the kind that bit at his ears and numbed his fingers, but inside he felt something stirring that was warmer than any fire. For every coat he placed around a shivering shoulder, for every meal he laid in someone's hands, the loneliness that had hollowed him out only hours before seemed to shrink a little more. The first man he helped, gray-bearded, with tired eyes that carried years of hard pavement, had clutched his loaf of bread as though it were gold. "God bless you," the man had whispered, voice trembling with sincerity. Henry had simply nodded, pressing his hand gently against the man's shoulder before moving on. A few steps later, he found a young woman sitting with two children huddled close against her. Their coats were thin, and the boys' shoes had holes that let the frost in. Henry knelt slowly before them, his knees aching, and unwrapped one of Mary's scarves. It was bright red, still smelling faintly of lavender from old drawers. He draped it around the girl's neck, then handed the boy a slice of pie so sweet and fragrant it made his eyes widen in disbelief. "Are you sure?" the mother asked, her voice wary, as though kindness might come with a cost she couldn't afford. "It's yours," Henry said softly. "Happy Thanksgiving." For a long moment she only stared at him, her lips trembling. Then she whispered, "Thank you," so quietly it almost dissolved into the night air. Henry rose, his joints stiff, and carried on. He moved from bench to bench, corner to corner, his arms emptying but his heart filling. Some thanked him with tears, others with silence, their eyes speaking louder than words. One man, younger than Michael, broke down completely when Henry pressed a coat into his hands, repeating, "I didn't think anyone remembered me today." Henry remembered. That was enough. What Henry didn't see was the girl on the far side of the park, college-aged, bundled in a puffy jacket, her phone lifted discreetly in her gloved hands. She had come out that night to film a short project for a campus assignment about kindness. Instead, she found herself transfixed by the sight of an old man moving quietly, methodically from person to person, handing out food and warmth as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She recorded him without even realizing she had started. The glow of the street lamps caught the lines in his face, the white of his hair, the gentleness in his every gesture. Through her camera, he looked almost biblical, an unlikely shepherd tending to his forgotten flock. Henry, of course, was unaware. He only knew that with every hand he touched, every thank you whispered through chattering teeth, the weight on his chest eased. He thought of Amanda then, not with anger, not even with disappointment anymore, but with a kind of quiet release. She might not have wanted him at her table, but here, among strangers who had no tables at all, he had found a purpose more genuine than any polished dinner could offer. As he handed the last loaf of bread to a man curled near the steps of the church, Henry felt his arms finally empty. He stood still, exhaling a long cloud of white breath, and looked around. The park was quieter now. People were eating, wrapped in coats, sharing food among themselves. For the first time that day, Henry didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he belonged to something larger, something truer. He placed his hands into his coat pockets and tilted his head back toward the dark sky. Stars blinked faintly through the haze of the city, and he thought Mary would be smiling right now. Behind him, the girl lowered her phone, her heart pounding with the certainty that she had just witnessed something rare, something that deserved to be seen by more than just the cold night air. Henry didn't notice her. He simply walked back to his old sedan, the trunk now empty, and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine. His hands, though chilled, no longer trembled. As he pulled away from the park, the laughter from nearby houses still filled the streets. But this time, Henry did not feel excluded. He felt strangely full. He had served a different dish that Thanksgiving, and though no one at Amanda's table would ever taste it, he knew it was richer than anything they had placed on their plates. Morning came slow and pale, with a thin mist clinging to the streets. Henry stirred awake later than usual, his body sore from the lifting, the walking, the bending of the night before. He rose carefully, stretching his stiff joints, and shuffled into the kitchen. The house greeted him with its usual silence, broken only by the drip of the coffee pot and the ticking clock on the wall. He poured himself a cup, sat down at the small table, and let his gaze drift to the mantel where Mary's picture rested. The boxes were gone, the food was gone, but in their place was a fullness he hadn't felt in years. He raised the mug toward her photo, whispering, "It was a good Thanksgiving after all, Mary." Henry didn't know it yet, but outside his small house the world had already begun to talk about him. Across town, the young college student who had filmed him sat at her desk with her laptop open. She had uploaded the video just before bed, titling it simply, "Old Man Shares Thanksgiving with the Homeless." By morning, her phone buzzed relentlessly. Notifications stacked one after another. Comments poured in. "Who is he? This broke my heart. Reminds me of my granddad. God bless this man." Within hours, the video had crossed from one platform to another, shared on local news pages, retweeted by strangers, picked up by morning talk shows searching for stories of hope in a fractured season. By noon, Henry's quiet act of kindness had been watched by hundreds of thousands. By evening, it was millions. He had no idea. He spent most of the day fixing a leaky faucet, reading the newspaper, and tinkering with the old clock in the hallway. It wasn't until a neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, knocked on his door holding her phone out, eyes wide, that he caught the first glimpse. "Henry," she said breathlessly, "is this you?" She turned the screen toward him. There he was, grainy in the glow of the street lights, bending down to hand a child a slice of pie, wrapping a scarf gently around a woman's neck. His figure looked smaller somehow on the phone screen, but the tenderness in his movements filled the frame. Henry blinked. "Where did you get this?" "It's everywhere," Mrs. Dawson said. "You're all over the internet. Everyone's calling you." She hesitated, then smiled. "They're calling you America's father." Henry felt his face flush. "Oh, I don't know about that." But that night, when he turned on the television, he couldn't escape it. The local station ran a segment about him. A reporter, standing in front of the same park he had visited, spoke of an unidentified man who reminded us all of what Thanksgiving truly means. Clips of him handing out food played again and again, his face soft, unassuming, almost reluctant in its kindness. Henry turned the volume down, shaking his head. He hadn't done it for recognition. He hadn't done it for applause. He had done it because the silence of his own table was too much to bear, and because Mary's memory had whispered for him to share what he had left. Still, as the hours passed, he began to realize what this attention meant. For every person praising him, someone else would begin to wonder, where was his family? Why had this man, so willing to give to strangers, spent Thanksgiving alone? By the following morning, the comments had shifted. Where are his kids? Why wasn't he at their table? Shame on the family that let him eat alone. At Amanda's house, the fallout came quickly. Her phone buzzed incessantly, friends forwarding the video, colleagues tagging her in posts, whispers spreading through the polished circles she valued so much. Richard, her husband, paced in the kitchen, muttering, "This is a nightmare. Do you realize how this looks?" Amanda scrolled through the comments, her hands trembling. Each one felt like a lash. Words like ungrateful, selfish, heartless burned on the screen. She shut the phone off, only to turn it back on again moments later, unable to look away. Michael, too, saw the video. Sitting in his apartment, he watched his father's face appear on the screen, watched him hand out food with the quiet gentleness Michael had grown up with. He swallowed hard, shame pressing against his chest. He hadn't called, hadn't invited, hadn't even asked how Dad was spending the holiday. And now the world was calling Henry a hero, while Michael knew the truth, that he had chosen silence over love. Back in his own house, Henry sat at the kitchen table once more, Mary's photograph watching over him, the television murmuring softly in the background. He still didn't know what to make of it all. Fame had never been his companion, but as he sipped his coffee, he wondered if perhaps this was not about him at all. Perhaps it was about reminding others, Amanda, Michael, anyone who had forgotten, that gratitude was never meant to be hidden, and love was never meant to be selective. The world now knew Henry Collins, but for him, the only thing that mattered was that, for one night, strangers had been fed, warmed, and remembered. Amanda sat at the end of her long dining table, her hands gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The chandelier above her gleamed with polished glass, the silverware on the table shone, but all she could hear was the relentless buzzing of her phone. Each vibration was another notification, another judgment cast by strangers who had seen the video of her father. Richard paced behind her, phone pressed to his ear as he snapped at someone on the line. "No, I don't want statements, just get this off the front page. This is bad optics." His voice was sharp, restless, the tone of a man more worried about reputation than truth. Amanda ignored him. She opened her phone once more, though she had promised herself she wouldn't. The comments scrolled endlessly. A father this good should never have been alone. How could his own children leave him out? Some people don't deserve their parents. Each word cut deeper than the last. Amanda pressed her palm against her forehead, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She remembered her childhood vividly, her father fixing her bike under the hot sun, his shirt soaked with sweat, him waiting in the car for hours while she was at piano lessons, always ready with a smile. He had been present in every corner of her growing up. And now here she was, the woman who had hidden his invitation under a pile of magazines because she feared he wouldn't fit with the image she wanted to project. Shame pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Across town, Michael sat slumped on his couch, the television replaying clips of his father in the park. Henry's hands, rough, worn, steady, extended toward strangers, each gesture an act of quiet dignity. Michael closed his eyes, remembering the same hands guiding his own when he was a boy learning to throw a baseball. His father had never let go then. Why had Michael let go now? The guilt was suffocating. He picked up his phone, thumb hovering over his father's number, then dropped it back onto the cushion. What would he even say? That he was sorry, that he had known about Amanda's plans but said nothing, that he had stayed silent while their father ate alone. Words seemed too small. At Amanda's house, Richard ended his call and turned to her. "You need to get ahead of this. A public apology. Maybe a photo of you and your father together, something to change the narrative." Amanda's head snapped up, anger flashing in her eyes. "This isn't about optics, Richard. This is about Dad. We left him alone on Thanksgiving. We treated him like he was something to hide." Richard frowned, unaccustomed to seeing his wife unravel. "Amanda." "No," she cut in, her voice breaking. "I don't care what the internet says. I don't care about the company or the parties or your colleagues. I care that my father sat in that house alone with Mom's picture because I couldn't bear the thought of him embarrassing me." Her words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, the polished perfection of her dining room felt like a prison, not an achievement. Amanda pushed back her chair, the legs scraping against the floor, and stood. Her heart pounded as she reached for her coat. Richard called after her, but she didn't answer. She knew where she needed to be. Michael, too, had made his decision. Hours later, when Amanda arrived at their father's house, she found Michael already sitting in his old sedan parked out front, his head bowed against the steering wheel. They walked to the porch together in silence, the weight of years of neglect pressing down on every step. Amanda knocked lightly on the door, her hands trembling. When the door opened, Henry stood there, wearing the same old cardigan, his eyes tired but warm. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The world outside might have been shouting, accusing, pointing fingers, but here in the doorway of this modest house, there was only a father and his children facing each other at last. Amanda's lips trembled. Tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Dad, I'm so sorry." Michael's voice cracked as he added, "We should have been here. We should have never left you alone." Henry studied their faces. He could see the shame etched into them, the regret heavier than any public criticism. He let the silence stretch, then finally reached out, placing one hand on Amanda's shoulder, the other on Michael's. "Thanksgiving," he said softly, "isn't about tables or silverware or who sits where. It's about being grateful. I'm grateful you're here now. That's enough for me." Amanda broke into sobs, falling into his arms, Michael close behind. For the first time in years, Henry felt the embrace of his family again, not polished, not perfect, but real. And outside, the world continued to talk. But in that small house, beneath the watchful smile of Mary's photograph, the only voices that mattered were finally speaking the words that should have been spoken long ago. The living room smelled faintly of cider and roasted chicken, remnants from the night before still lingering in the air. Henry stood by the mantel, staring at Mary's picture as Amanda and Michael hovered nearby, uncertain but present. The house was small, its furniture worn, yet for the first time in years it felt alive. Amanda slipped into the kitchen, returning with a half-empty pie tin she found on the counter. Michael followed, setting the table almost clumsily, as though trying to remember a ritual they had once known by heart. Henry watched them, his throat tightening. For years, he had dreamed of seeing them here again, of hearing their voices echo through the rooms. They sat together, just the three of them, around the old wooden table. The candle Henry had lit for Mary still sat in the center, its wax melted low flame flickering faintly. Amanda reached for it, steadying the glass base as if it might collapse. "Do you think Mom would forgive us?" she asked softly. Henry's eyes glistened. He placed his hand gently over hers. "Your mother believed in love more than anything. She'd say forgiveness is what keeps love alive." Michael lowered his head, his voice rough. "I don't deserve it. We let pride get in the way of being a family." Henry looked at both of them, his children, grown now, successful in their own ways, but suddenly small again in the quiet of this room. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried both pain and peace. "I don't need apologies," he said. "I just need you to remember that family is not about appearances. It's about showing up, about choosing each other even when it's inconvenient, even when it's messy." Amanda's tears fell freely. She reached across the table, clasping her father's hand. Michael joined, their hands overlapping. The silence between them filled not with absence but with a fragile, healing presence. They shared the simple meal together, passing plates, laughing awkwardly at first, then more freely as the evening wore on. It wasn't perfect. The food was plain, the pie nearly gone, the dishes mismatched. But it was real. And in that small house, with the candle flickering low and Mary's photograph watching over them, it was the truest Thanksgiving they had ever known. Henry leaned back in his chair, listening to his children's voices fill the room once more. For years, he had wondered if he had lost them forever. Tonight, he realized he had never truly lost them. They had only needed to be reminded of what mattered. And for Henry, that reminder had come not from polished tables or gilded invitations, but from a different dish. The dish of love given freely, shared with strangers, now returned to him by his own family. Dear friends, thank you for spending time with us in this story on Family Shadows. May it remind us all that gratitude and love should never be hidden but shared. I wish you health, peace, and the warmth of family in your own home. From our table to yours, happy Thanksgiving, and may your days be filled with kindness.